By 1944, Japanese gun crews at Rabaul could still look through their sights and see the approaches to Simpson Harbor. The guns were loaded, the tunnels were occupied, the beaches were defended. Roughly 100,000 Japanese troops were still on New Britain, and the invasion they had prepared to destroy never came. Rabaul had not surrendered, it had not been stormed. Much of the fortress was still physically intact, yet the Allies had already found a way to make it strategically useless. How do you defeat a fortress without taking it? The answer was not a single battle. It was a change in what the Allies decided victory had to mean. Rabaul sat on the northeastern end of New Britain, wrapped around Simpson Harbor, one of the most valuable anchorages in the South Pacific. After Japanese forces captured the area in early 1942, the base became a major headquarters, air center, supply hub, and naval staging point for operations toward New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Its value came from geography first. Simpson Harbor was deep and protected. Volcanic ridges surrounded the anchorage. The ground around Rabaul was well suited to excavation, and Japanese engineers exploited it aggressively. They dug an extensive network of tunnels and underground facilities, moving men, supplies, hospitals, command posts, and storage spaces beneath cover that was difficult to destroy from the air. Above ground, several major airfields gave Japanese aircraft a platform from which to threaten Allied shipping and forward positions across the region. Rabaul was not simply a place that had to be defended. It was a machine for projecting power. Aircraft could move out from its fields, warships could use its harbor, supplies could pass through it to forward garrisons. Commanders could coordinate operations across a wide section of the South Pacific. And by 1943, the Japanese had also turned it into something else. A trap. The garrison grew to an enormous size. Coastal guns covered likely approaches. Anti-aircraft batteries protected the base. Beaches and ridgelines were prepared for a landing. The tunnel system gave the defenders places to survive bombardment and emerge again when an assault force came ashore. The basic calculation was easy to understand. If the Allies wanted Rabaul, they would have to come by sea. If they came by sea, transports and landing craft would have to concentrate near defended beaches. If they concentrated near defended beaches, Japanese aircraft, shore batteries, submarines, and ground troops could attack them inside a relatively confined battle space. The stronger Rabaul became, the more expensive a direct assault appeared. And that was part of its purpose. Japan could not match American industrial production over a long war, but a fortress did not need to outproduce the United States. It only needed to make the next step so costly that the offensive slowed, resources were consumed, and political pressure increased. Rabaul offered the possibility of exactly that kind of fight. The problem for the Allies was that ignoring it also seemed dangerous. In conventional military thinking, a base with aircraft, warships, fuel, repair facilities, and a huge garrison could not simply be left behind an advancing force. If it remained operational, it could strike convoys, threaten newly captured positions, and cut the lines that kept the offensive moving. This mattered because the Pacific War was being fought over distances that punished every logistical mistake. A division could win a beachhead and still become helpless if ammunition, food, fuel, engineering equipment, and replacement aircraft could not reach it. A fleet could dominate one patch of water and still be forced away if its fuel and maintenance system could not keep pace. An airfield could exist on a map and remain useless until engineers built the runway, brought in fuel, installed radar, moved in spare parts, and protected it with anti-aircraft guns. So the question was not simply whether Rabaul could shoot. The question was whether Rabaul could continue to reach outward and interfere with the Allied advance. That distinction became the center of the new strategy. Before the Allies reached that point, they had already learned how expensive direct fighting against determined Japanese defenses could be. Guadalcanal had consumed ships, aircraft, supplies, and men. Fighting around Buna and Gona in New Guinea had shown how even smaller Japanese positions could become brutal when terrain, disease, supply problems, and defensive preparation worked together. Rabaul was larger, deeper, and far more heavily developed. A frontal invasion would require landing craft, escort ships, aircraft, infantry, engineers, artillery, fuel, medical support, and an enormous reserve of shipping. Those resources were not unlimited. The United States was also fighting a major war in Europe. Even a successful attack could tie down men and ships for months. And success would mean giving the defenders the battle they had spent years preparing to fight. So Allied planners changed the problem. Instead of asking, how do we capture Rabaul? They asked, what does Rabaul need in order to matter? The answer was revealing. It needed nearby positions that could warn it of Allied movement. It needed airfields from which aircraft could operate safely. It needed a harbor where major ships could remain useful. It needed sea lanes that could bring in fuel, ammunition, food, aircraft, and replacement equipment. And it needed enough freedom of movement to send power outward. Take those things away, and the fortress could remain standing while its purpose collapsed. That idea became central to Operation Cartwheel, the Allied campaign approved in 1943 to neutralize Rabaul while advancing through the Southwest Pacific and the Solomons. General Douglas MacArthur's forces pushed along New Guinea and toward the Bismarck Archipelago. Admiral William Halsey's forces moved through the Solomon Islands from the east. The two advances did not drive straight into Simpson Harbor. They closed around it. On the map, the two axes looked almost elegant. In reality, they were a chain of separate engineering and combat problems. MacArthur could not simply draw a line toward New Britain and move along it. Every step up the New Guinea coast depended on landing sites, air cover, unloading capacity, roads, weather, and the ability to protect ships that might remain exposed while cargo came ashore. Halsey's forces faced a similar problem in the Solomons. An island could be strategically useful and still be physically miserable. Jungle, mud, coral, disease, poor roads, narrow beaches, and terrain that could hide defenders only a short distance from a new runway site. This made Cartwheel less like a clean pincer and more like a sequence of small mechanical locks that had to open in the right order. Positions such as Woodlark and Kiriwina helped extend Allied reach from the southwest. Fighting through New Georgia and toward Bougainville pushed the eastern side of the ring closer, with the Treasury Islands and other forward positions adding depth to the Allied approach. Across this expanding network, airfields, radar, staging areas, and small craft bases increased what Allied forces could support closer to Rabaul. None of these places replaced Rabaul by themselves. Their value came from combination. A fighter strip without fuel was useless. A radar station without a protected communications link was fragile. A bomber base without fighter cover could be punished. A harbor without nearby air cover could become a trap. The Allied advantage was that each new position could support the next one. That created a compounding effect. A new runway did not merely put aircraft closer to Rabaul. It also helped protect convoys carrying the materials for another runway farther forward. Radar could warn those aircraft. Patrol boats could operate from nearer waters. Engineers could unload more equipment under a wider protective umbrella. The campaign became a contest over connected nodes. Rabaul was one enormous node. The Allies were building many smaller ones around it. That difference mattered because a single large base can be exceptionally strong and still become vulnerable when the network feeding it breaks. A distributed network can lose one position and continue to move through others. The Japanese had concentrated tremendous power at one geographic point. The Allies were distributing power across a growing arc. The closer that arc came, the harder it became for Rabaul to exploit its own concentration. This was not the simple version of island hopping, in which strong places were ignored because they were inconvenient. Bypassing Rabaul was only possible if every bypass threat could be controlled. That made the strategy dangerous. An Allied landing on a lightly held island could look attractive on a planning map, but the transports delivering troops were vulnerable. A newly cleared airstrip was vulnerable. Supply dumps were vulnerable. Engineers working in mud and tropical heat were vulnerable. As long as Rabaul could launch aircraft and send ships into the surrounding seas, every new Allied position was being built within reach of a much larger enemy base. The Allies were gambling that they could change the geometry faster than Rabaul could punish them for it. They seized positions that had specific operational value rather than symbolic value. A patch of ground mattered if it could hold an airstrip. A harbor mattered if small craft could use it. A ridge mattered if radar could see from it. A new base mattered if fighters could cover the next movement. This was a campaign measured not only in miles but in aircraft range, fuel consumption, shipping time, and the distance between one usable runway and the next. The construction units were as important to that process as the assault troops. Once ground was secured, engineers and Navy Seabees moved rapidly to build and improve airfields, roads, fuel storage, radar sites, and defensive positions. Jungle and coral became runways. Runways became forward fighter bases. Forward fighter bases became protection for bombers and shipping. And every time the Allies moved an airfield closer to Rabaul, the fortress lost another part of the distance that had once protected it. That distance was not abstract. Aircraft carried limited fuel. A bomber that had to spend most of its fuel simply reaching Rabaul had less freedom over the target. It had less time to search, maneuver, make another pass, or carry the maximum useful load for the mission. Move the airfields forward and the calculation changed. Fighters could escort farther. Bombers could arrive with more flexibility. Raids could be repeated more often. Damaged Japanese facilities could be struck again before repairs were complete. The air war over Rabaul stopped being a distant raid against a protected fortress and became a sustained contest fought from an expanding ring of Allied bases. The pressure also attacked time. A base survives bombing not only by absorbing damage, but by repairing it. Runways must be filled and resurfaced. Craters have to be cleared. Aircraft need maintenance. Fuel drums have to be moved. Communications lines must be restored. Anti-aircraft positions need ammunition and replacement crews. Rabaul's tunnels were excellent protection for people and stores, but aircraft still had to emerge onto runways. Ships still had to enter the harbor. Trucks still had to move on exposed roads. Repair parties still needed hours without interruption. As raids became more frequent, the interval between damage and the next attack became part of the weapon. The Japanese could repair one crater, only to face another strike. Aircraft could be dispersed, only to find the field threatened again. A harbor that had once concentrated naval strength now concentrated targets that had to be protected every hour they remained there. This was where the loss of peripheral warning positions hurt. Early warning gives defenders time to scramble fighters, move aircraft, man guns, and prepare for an incoming raid. As the Allied perimeter advanced, Japanese observation and warning systems around Rabaul came under increasing pressure. The base was not literally blind, but its margin for reacting to attack narrowed while the number of Allied directions increased. The defenders were forced into a rhythm they did not control. Morning attack, repair, alert, another attack, night harassment, more repair, fuel conservation, ammunition conservation. The physical fortress could absorb this rhythm. Its offensive system could not absorb it forever. The Japanese had prepared Rabaul to absorb punishment. But the Allied objective was becoming different from destroying every tunnel or every gun. They needed to prevent the base from operating effectively outside its perimeter. That meant the airfields and harbor mattered more than the underground shelters. A soldier in a tunnel could survive a bombing raid. A fighter without fuel could not intercept a convoy. A cruiser hidden in a protected anchorage could not influence the campaign if the anchorage itself became too dangerous to use. 100,000 troops could remain armed and still become strategically isolated if they could not be moved to the place where the next battle was being decided. Late in 1943, the pressure on Rabaul intensified. Allied aircraft attacked from multiple directions and from bases that were now close enough to sustain repeated operations. High-altitude bombing was part of the effort, but low-level attacks also made the harbor increasingly hazardous. Modified B-25 Mitchell bombers were used in aggressive low-level strikes. Their forward-firing machine guns could suppress exposed anti-aircraft positions and rake shipping, while low-level bombing methods, including skip bombing techniques used in the theater, increased the threat to vessels inside confined waters. The important point was not that one aircraft type defeated Rabaul. It did not. The important point was that the harbor could no longer be treated as a sanctuary once Allied air power could reach it repeatedly, from nearby bases, with different methods and growing escort strength. That changed the value of every ship inside Simpson Harbor. A warship at anchor was no longer simply an asset. It was also a target that might be lost before it could contribute to the next operation. Japanese commanders could keep major ships under increasing air attack, or move them away from Rabaul. The surviving heavy naval units were withdrawn northward, including toward Truk. That decision removed one of the most dangerous parts of Rabaul's outward reach. The fortress still had guns, it still had troops, it still had tunnels, but it no longer had the same ability to send major surface forces into the surrounding seas. The strategic equation narrowed again. Now the question became supply. A garrison approaching 100,000 men represented enormous stored combat power, but only if it could be fed, fueled, armed, repaired, and moved. Food alone was a daily problem on a vast scale. Aircraft required fuel and spare parts. Anti-aircraft guns required ammunition. Hospitals required medicine. Vehicles required maintenance. The base had accumulated stockpiles, but stockpiles are temporary by definition. Once consumption continues and replacement slows, even a fortress begins to count what it has left. Large merchant ships had once carried the volume that a base like Rabaul needed. As Allied air patrols, naval forces, and submarines tightened control over the approaches, those large supply movements became increasingly difficult and costly. Japan tried to adapt. Destroyers could make faster runs. Submarines could carry cargo. Small barges could move near coastlines and use darkness and concealment. These methods could deliver something. They could not deliver enough to restore the old system. There was another problem hidden inside the shrinking supply flow. The larger the garrison, the less flexible the situation became. An army of this size could not simply be packed onto a few ships and moved north when the strategic situation changed. Evacuation required transport capacity, loading areas, escorts, air cover, fuel, planning time, and sea routes that could survive Allied attack. Once the harbor and surrounding waters became dangerous, the very act of concentrating enough transports to remove tens of thousands of men would create a target on a scale the Japanese could no longer protect reliably. So the garrison faced a one-way logistical problem. It was difficult to supply. It was even more difficult to evacuate. This trapped the Japanese command between two different kinds of loss. Keep the men at Rabaul, and the Empire had to find some way to sustain an enormous force that was contributing less and less to the wider war. Try to remove them, and scarce shipping would have to enter a zone increasingly dominated by Allied aircraft and submarines. The fortress had been designed around the assumption that the decisive question would be whether an attacker could get in. By 1944, the more important question was whether the defenders could get out. The answer was increasingly no. That changed the meaning of the stockpiles buried under the volcanic ground. Early in the campaign, stored ammunition, food, and fuel represented endurance. Later, each stockpile became a clock. Every ration eaten and every shell fired reduced a reserve that could no longer be replaced at the old rate. Conservation therefore became operational behavior. A fighter sortie had to justify fuel. An anti-aircraft engagement had to justify ammunition. A damaged vehicle had to justify spare parts. The base could still resist, but resistance and influence were no longer the same thing. That was the arithmetic the fortress could not escape. A submarine converted to cargo duty might carry urgently needed supplies, but every ton used for rice or medicine was a ton not moving in the vast holds of a freighter. A coastal barge could slip through waters where a larger ship was easier to detect, but its cargo capacity was tiny compared with what a force of this size consumed. Fast destroyer runs could solve immediate shortages, but they exposed scarce warships to a dangerous route and could not replace a secure merchant pipeline. The Japanese had created a fortress that was extremely difficult to assault. They had not created one that could live indefinitely without access to the sea. As the flow of supplies fell, the physical condition of the base changed. Aircraft that could not be fueled were no longer useful as an offensive force. Ammunition had to be conserved. Repairs became harder. The garrison's priorities shifted from preparing to project power toward preserving itself. And then came the strangest transformation of all. The soldiers began farming. The transformation did not erase the military routine. That made it more unsettling. Gun crews still maintained their weapons. Infantry still occupied prepared positions. Men continued to work inside the tunnel network and around defended beaches. The fortress remained organized around the possibility that one day the Allied fleet would finally appear. At the same time, more and more labor had to be devoted to producing food locally and keeping the isolated force alive. So two different versions of Rabaul existed beside each other. One was the fortress Japan had built, armed, fortified, dug into volcanic ground, ready to punish an amphibious assault. The other was the Rabaul created by isolation, conserving, planting, repairing, rationing, and waiting. That contrast mattered because it showed the difference between tactical readiness and strategic usefulness. A coastal battery could remain perfectly ready for a target that never entered its range. An infantry battalion could remain disciplined while lacking the ships needed to move it to another campaign. A bunker could remain intact while the war's decisive fronts moved hundreds of miles away. The defenders were not defeated in the ordinary visual language of war. There was no final wall breached, no mass surrender at the moment of neutralization. No single battle in which the entire garrison was destroyed. Instead, the evidence accumulated in absences. Fewer major ships in the harbor, fewer opportunities to use the airfields offensively, fewer large supply ships arriving safely, more dependence on local food production, more weapons whose useful range stopped at a perimeter the enemy no longer needed to cross. That kind of defeat is harder to photograph, but it can be just as decisive at the operational level. The garrison remained a force that would be dangerous if attacked. The Allies made sure it did not have to be attacked. General Hitoshi Imamura's 8th Area Army had been organized to fight. Its men had weapons, training, fortifications, and years of preparation behind them. But isolation made calories a strategic problem. The garrison expanded local food production around Rabaul and elsewhere in its defended area. Troops cultivated crops including sweet potatoes and other food plants in whatever usable ground could be worked. Military labor was redirected towards survival. The visual contradiction was extraordinary. Near one of the most heavily defended bases in the Pacific, soldiers who had prepared for amphibious assault were also digging, planting, carrying water, and trying to make the local ground produce enough food to reduce dependence on a supply system that no longer worked. That did not mean the garrison had become harmless. This is an important limitation. The Japanese forces on New Britain remained armed. Their fortifications remained dangerous. A direct Allied assault would still have been costly. Local fighting elsewhere on the island did not simply vanish, and the Allies still had to maintain air and naval pressure to keep Rabaul isolated. Neutralization was not the same thing as occupation. Containment also imposed a continuing cost on the Allies. Airfields had to be supplied. Patrols had to continue, aircraft still had to fly. Ships still had to watch the approaches, and the isolated Japanese force could not simply be forgotten as long as it retained weapons and local defensive power. But this cost was different from the cost of conquest. Containment demanded enough force to keep Rabaul from recovering its reach. A direct assault would have demanded enough force to penetrate the defenses, occupy the ground, clear fortified positions, absorb casualties, and then garrison what had been captured. That trade-off was the heart of the decision. The Allies accepted an unfinished map in exchange for continued momentum. But at the theater level, that distinction was exactly what made the strategy work. The Allies did not need every Japanese soldier at Rabaul to be defeated in a firefight. They needed those soldiers to be unable to effect the next decisive movement. By 1944, the center of the Pacific War was moving far beyond Rabaul. The Allies were advancing toward the Admiralties, the northern coast of New Guinea, and eventually back toward the Philippines. Farther north and west, other campaigns began to determine the fate of Japan's defensive perimeter. Rabaul remained behind them, not conquered, contained. Its troops could hear and receive news of a war that was moving away from them. They had men, they had weapons, they had fortifications that had consumed immense labor. But they lacked the means to move that strength to the places where it could still alter the campaign. This also forced a reconsideration of one of the oldest instincts in warfare, the urge to destroy the enemy's strongest point because it is the strongest point. A fortress naturally attracts attention. Its guns are visible. Its troop count is impressive. Its defenses appear to demand an answer. Leaving it untouched can feel like leaving unfinished business behind. But strategic value is not permanent. It depends on relationship. A port matters because ships can reach it and leave it. An airfield matters because aircraft can be fueled, armed, protected, and sent somewhere useful. A headquarters matters because it can communicate with forces that still obey and can still move. A garrison matters because it can threaten something the enemy needs. Operation Cartwheel did not erase those facts. It changed the relationships around them. Rabaul's harbor remained deep. The volcanic ridges remained high. The tunnels remained difficult to destroy. The guns remained dangerous. But Allied control of the surrounding operational space steadily reduced what those advantages could accomplish. This was why the strategy saved more than the casualties of one hypothetical assault. It also saved time and opportunity. Every division committed to clearing Rabaul cave by cave would be a division unavailable elsewhere. Every landing craft tied to New Britain could not support another landing. Every carrier or cruiser held nearby would be one less asset available for the next operation. By neutralizing Rabaul instead of occupying it, the Allies were able to continue moving while the Japanese garrison stayed fixed in place. In strategic terms, that was a reversal of the trap. Japan had intended Rabaul to stop the Allied advance by forcing the attackers to concentrate against it. Instead, Allied pressure forced Japan to keep an enormous force concentrated at Rabaul while the offensive passed beyond it. The fortress did not consume the Allied advance. The fortress consumed Japanese manpower that could no longer be redeployed. This exposed a difference that is easy to miss when military power is counted only by soldiers, guns, aircraft, and bunkers. Power is not what an army possesses. Power is what it can use, where it can use it, and for how long. Rabaul had enormous physical strength. Operation Cartwheel attacked its ability to convert that strength into useful action. First, the Allies reduced the value of the outer positions that supported and warned the base. Then they created forward airfields that brought sustained air power closer. That made the airspace and harbor increasingly dangerous. The withdrawal of major warships reduced naval reach. Pressure on the sea lanes reduced supply. Reduced supply limited aircraft operations. Ammunition use, repair, and mobility. And once the garrison could neither project power effectively nor be evacuated safely, its immense size became part of the problem. A small isolated outpost is a small burden. An isolated army of roughly 100,000 men is a daily logistical crisis. The strength designed to make Rabaul impossible to conquer helped make it impossible to move. This is why the story of Rabaul is more than a story about bypassing a fortress. Bypassing was only the visible decision. The real achievement was building the conditions that made bypassing safe enough to continue. If the Allies had simply sailed past while Rabaul retained strong air cover, reliable supply, forward warning, and major naval forces, the strategy could have failed catastrophically. The bypass worked because it was followed by a systematic reduction of reach. That required infantry to seize selected positions. It required engineers to build bases quickly. It required pilots to maintain pressure. It required ships and submarines to contest the supply routes. It required radar, maintenance crews, fuel handlers, construction battalions, and an enormous transport system of the Allies' own. Rabaul was strangled by logistics because the Allies were increasingly able to solve their logistics better than Japan could solve its own. That was the deeper asymmetry. Japan had concentrated combat power inside a fortress. The Allies built a moving network outside it. One side had prepared the ground for the battle it expected. The other side changed the location and form of the battle. The result was a fortress that remained formidable at the exact task for which it had been designed. If a major amphibious fleet had entered its prepared kill zones, the coastal guns, tunnels, mines, anti-aircraft batteries, and defenders could have made the attack devastating. But those defenses could not force the Allies to arrive. They could not extend the range of a fighter with an empty fuel tank. They could not turn a barge into a freighter. They could not make a cruiser safe inside a harbor dominated from the air. They could not move an army across seas the Allies increasingly controlled. The fortress was powerful against assault. It was weak against irrelevance. The Japanese command had invested heavily in surviving destruction. The Allies attacked function instead. That is why Rabaul's tunnels matter to the story, but not in the obvious way. Their strength helped explain why a direct attack looks so unattractive. Yet the tunnels also reveal the limit of passive protection. A tunnel can preserve a soldier. It cannot give him strategic reach. The same was true of the coastal guns. They were lethal if a target entered their field of fire. They could do nothing to an enemy that chose a different route. The same was true of the immense Garrison. Its numbers promised terrible resistance on New Britain. They meant far less once the campaign's decisive movements took place beyond New Britain. This was the operational lesson hidden inside the untouched fortress. A stronghold is not neutralized because every wall is broken. It is neutralized when the system around it no longer lets its strength matter. The Allies did not discover a magical way to win without cost. Operation Cartwheel still required hard fighting across New Guinea and the Solomons. Men died taking the positions that made the encirclement possible. Aircraft and ships were lost. Bases had to be carved out of difficult ground and kept supplied across long ocean routes. The strategy did not eliminate violence. It concentrated violence where the Allies believed it would produce greater strategic return, while denying Japan the enormous frontal battle Rabaul had been prepared to deliver. That difference mattered. Instead of spending months trying to clear every cave around Simpson Harbor, the Allies spent their effort taking the places that changed range, warning, air cover, and shipping control. Instead of measuring progress by whether an American flag flew over Rabaul, they measured whether Japanese aircraft could still sortie effectively, whether major ships could remain in the harbor, whether supply ships could get through, and whether the garrison could influence operations outside New Britain. One by one, those answers moved toward no. By the time the war moved on, Rabaul had become one of the most striking paradoxes of the Pacific. A fortress with troops but little mobility, airfields without the freedom they once provided, a harbor whose strategic value had been sharply reduced, guns pointed at beaches the enemy no longer needed, and fields cultivated by soldiers whose primary enemy had become isolation itself. The final proof was not a captured bunker or a raised flag. It was the empty horizon in front of guns that were still waiting to fire.